Good afternoon and welcome to the opening of Europe in the World Days. I'm delighted to see such a packed hall, literally standing room only, which I think is a very good indication of the level of interest and excitement about the next few days here in Altbach. A few words about myself. My name is Suzanne Lynch. I'm Chief Brussels Correspondent with Politico and the host of EU Confidential, our weekly podcast on EU affairs, which incidentally we will be broadcasting from here this week, so look out for that later in the week. Now, before I run through a bit about how the next couple of hours are going to be organised, just a little bit about the theme of the next few days and indeed our discussion over the next few hours. I was very taken by the phrase bold Europe. We really are meeting at a pivotal time for the European Union and Europe more broadly, and never was there such a need really for that idea, that notion of a bold, decisive Europe. Obviously, and I think without a doubt, most significantly, war has returned to the European continent following the Russian invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And that is going to be part of our discussion here this afternoon. But there are other challenges also facing Europe. The challenges of the green transition, for example. We also have issues of competitiveness and the economy, the cost of living crisis that a lot of Europeans are really feeling, and soaring inflation. And all of this is taking place ahead of a very important year next year, which will be the European elections, when members of the European Parliament will be elected right across the EU. And of course, that changing of the guard at the European Commission and the Council and all those senior jobs in Brussels that will follow those elections next year. So we're really kind of gearing up to that election season in the coming months. Little bit about how this is going to work today. As you've probably seen from the agenda, we've got two panels with very high level contributors, so delighted to be chairing those debates. But they will also be interspersed with some interventions by other individuals, both here in person and remotely. But we do encourage collaboration and engagement, even though we've really got such a packed audience here, but also people watching online. So, for those of you who haven't yet, please do download the app, the EFA app, Exhibit A here, and you can follow the chat and submit questions through that app. Also, we will be taking questions from the floor, and we do have some roving mics. So again, would love to kind of encourage as much participation as possible within the time constraints we have. So to kick things off, I'd like to welcome to the stage EFA President Andreas Treichel for a welcome and opening speech.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Mr. President, Hereditary Prince, Prime Minister, Ministers, Excellencies, opposition leaders, Nobel Prize winners, wonderful people all here in this room. It's a very moving moment. Let me quickly go a little bit back into history in order to explain what bold means. The founders of the European Union were extremely bold. They founded a union within years after the end of the Second World War, after a period in which they have all, the founding fathers of the European Union, have all lived through two world wars in which they fought against each other or side by side, but they decided to develop a peace project for Europe together. If you think about the history of Europe before that, if you just take the 500 years from 1445 to 1945, what was Europe? Europe was an incredibly belligerent continent. And this belligerence took, in reality, three shapes. Either Europeans killed each other, or Europeans killed people on other continents in order to exploit them, or thirdly, they did both at the same time. And they did that for 500 years. Since 1945, now, within the Union, we had some quarrels, but we had 78 years of peace. That has never, ever happened before in the history of Europe, and it looks very likely that this might continue. In that 78 years, Europe became the strongest economy on this planet within 50 years, in the mid-90s, the largest exporter on this planet, the largest consumer market on this planet, and at the same time, it housed probably the most socially balanced society in the world. We did not fly to the moon. We did not produce incredibly advanced military equipment, but instead we built a wonderful social fabric, an unparalleled health system, and we built the best cars on this planet. We dreamt of a world without violence. We dreamt of a world in which borders would never, ever again be changed by force. We dreamt of a world that would live in peace forever, in which the rich were willing to share with the poor, and in which everybody who was able to work did their best in order to support those who could not work. A world in which education was available for everybody. What we worked for in Europe, we hoped could be copy-pasted around the globe. We were proud. In the early 90s, I was so proud to be a European, and not to mention, I'm still proud to be a European because I still have a lot of hope. But we were incredibly confident. And somewhere along the way, we lost it. Europe was still bold in its announcements, but it became weaker in its accomplishments. Economically, we started to fall back in the early 90s. Politically, we still took bold actions into the 2000s with the EU enlargement. Obviously, we had some energy left politically from 1989. But what did Europe achieve during the last 15 years that was really, really, really bold? I believe that any union, whether private or public, requires constant nurturing, not only to advance, but also to maintain stability. Take the European Union as a peace project. What happened during the last 15 years? Croatia became a member in 2013. And 3 years later, we lost a member due to outrageous populism. Brexit is a warning sign for all countries in Europe because it demonstrates what can happen if national politicians blame everything that goes wrong on Brussels. And we left the Western Balkans hanging. Why? Of course, because of Serbia and Kosovo, but also because we believe there's too much corruption. There's too much corruption in many states within the Union, but every state within the Union is, well, almost any state within the Union is now less corrupt than it was before it entered the Union. So what's the acceptable level of corruption to be a member of a peace project? What's that question? In my view, it's just reasoning in order to justify why we do not move ahead. We have lost the confidence that we can manage, and therefore we're not bold anymore. Accepting the Western Balkans as full members of the Union would be very, very bold. And in my view, not doable unless the EU's constitution, the EU treaty, is changed and the rule of unanimity is abolished. Unanimity has no place in a democratic union, and if it is not abolished, one day the union will fall apart. Yes, we have the passerelle clause, we have a lot of reasons to circumvent it, but why don't we take the courage and be really bold and say, let's do it. It will offer opportunities for us that we've never dreamt of before. Take another aspect of the European Union as a peace project. We learned about 30 years ago that we were not capable, although at that time we were the strongest economy on this planet, to contain a genocide on European soil without outside help. 30 years ago. What was Europe's reaction to that? The result can be found as of February 24th last year. We're still not able to avoid a war on European soil without outside help. The Union's defense spending are the third largest in the world, behind the USA and China. We spend far more than double on our defense than Russia, but we're still not able to defend our borders. That's not bold, that's shameful, and I find it absurd. Let's do something about it. Take the European Union as an economic project. What happened over the last 15 years? Our union has not kept up with the digitization of the business world. We remain somewhat stuck in the industrial age. We have no data union, we have no capital markets union, we're great at regulation, but we still allow too many differing regulations in the countries, which hinder our energy systems to become one, our trains to run across borders in a well-connected railway system, and our telecom networks to adapt to our new needs quickly. This kind of regulation limits our economic power. We have outstanding scientists in Europe. We have outstanding entrepreneurs in Europe. But we don't have enough capital to keep them here. We don't bring things to an end. We started a banking union, but we haven't finished it because European states cannot agree on a European deposit insurance system. We started a currency union 21 years ago, but today 7 out of 27 states are still not members. We issued a huge recovery and resilience fund after the pandemic, but we don't strive for true cross-border projects in Europe. We aspire to be the world champion in decarbonization, and we have the most powerful automotive industry on the planet, but as of today, China produces more electric cars than Europe. Europe as an endeavor was really bold. The people who created it were very bold, but it needs generations of bold politicians in Brussels and in the nation states to nurture it, to cultivate it, to maintain it, to grow it, and to build a Europe that we all believe will be peaceful for the next 200 years. The founding mothers and fathers were brave politicians, and we still have a lot of them. And some of them are here in this room. And they need all our support. They need it desperately in order to keep up the upper hand for Europe. To implement change requires a lot of energy, but to implement change in times of complacency is even harder and requires even more energy. And complacency always ends up in deterioration, and deterioration sometimes ends up in disaster. Let's not wait for that. We're here in Altbach to discuss the 4 most important issues for Europe and our planet: climate, technology and economic prosperity, security, as well as democracy and the rule of law. We're pretty advanced in some points. We have fallen back in some. We will need a lot of pressure from each and everyone who believes in Europe to give the power to those leaders in Europe that want a stronger Europe to succeed. The young generation has demonstrated what it can achieve in the past. They did overcome political and ideological differences and barriers to fight the most important common cause. Fridays for Future was really effective. So I'm asking you to develop the same kind of passion to fight for prosperity, for technological leadership, for security, for freedom, for democracy and the rule of law. Next year's EU elections do not look very promising. The forces that take no interest in a stronger European Union are gaining momentum. Christian and social democratic parties all over Europe are adopting nationalistic and anti-European views in an ill-guided attempt to gain votes. The BRICS are getting stronger. Autocracy is on the rise on many continents, and who knows how the elections in the United States will go next year. There's an enormous urgency to create a peaceful, united, and economically strong Europe now. This will require huge determination and the willingness to be incredibly bold. Let's get it rolling.
Thank you very much for those thoughts from Andreas Treichel, really giving us some food for thought and a really interesting framing for the discussion we're going to have over the next few hours, really hitting on some of those key points that are facing Europe at the moment. We're now going to hear from someone at the coalface of what's happening in Europe and Ukraine at the moment, the Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration, Ola Stefanishyna. Now, she could not be with us today, but has presented a video message. So we're going to hear now from Ola Stefanishyna.
Dear participants, colleagues, Minister, thank you for focusing on very important issues and focusing around building stronger, peaceful and prosperous Europe, which would inevitably lead to, first and foremost, ending the war on its territory. We all are living in these times of decisive transformations and decisive challenges for the future of Europe as a whole. Unprecedented challenges we face demand new determination, new and redoubled courage. They demand leadership. Here in my country, many people who dream about peaceful tomorrow do not get it. Russia brutally continues shelling theaters, schools, kindergartens, homes, taking the lives of Ukrainians day by day. This is the reality I'm addressing to you from. The reality in which Ukraine marked its 32nd anniversary of restoration of its independence. Again, under the constant danger, the day before, despite the threats and air raids in Kiev, world leaders convened the Crimean platform together with President of Ukraine, sending a clear message of unity. On that very day, Russia struck a deadly blow at the Ukrainian school in Romny, claiming the lives of 4 innocents, once again showing disrespect to international law values and, first and foremost, to human life. This war is not only about Ukraine, of course. It will define the world we all are going to live in, and will define if everything we built to restore peace in Europe after the Second World War is effective and will be effective further. Lawlessness and terror can only be countered in unity and strength. For the sake of bringing back peace in Europe, we have to find and use all available and not even available options to deprive Russia of the possibility to conduct the war and show the example of aggression to others who might follow. Of course, we call for sanctions to be strengthened, assets to be frozen, war criminals and those who helped them brought to justice. The aggressor should be held accountable for all crimes committed since 2014. We must leave no room for any legitimization of the aggression, and Russia continues attempts to destroy the global peace mechanisms. There should be no room for that, and this is the struggle. We all are concentrated around that. President Zelensky's peace formula and the discussions around that are luckily remain the only realistic and comprehensive plan to restore Ukraine's territorial integrity, to preserve the global security architecture itself. As such, we call on the partners to join the mechanisms working on this special tribunal procedure, which is enshrined in a core group. It now includes 38 countries, and for us, this tribunal is about fair sentences and the recognition of the direct responsibility of all, not only the perpetrators, but also those who gave orders, inspired, and strategized the war. Dear Austrians and colleagues, we of course extend heartfelt thanks for your unwavering commitment and support of Ukraine and Ukrainians who you warmly host in your soil while they are escaping the horrors of war. We know that you also support the reconstruction efforts of our country, supporting the energy reconstruction and recovery, demining efforts, ensuring global food security through your political efforts. Ukrainians clearly understand that our future is in our joint, prosperous Europe, and our future lies in EU and NATO membership. This is vital for both our nation, of course, our people, and for Europe as a whole. As you know, war didn't stop us from transformation, didn't stop us from our commitment to restore and rebuild back our place in a secure family of European nations. More than a year ago, Ukraine was granted EU candidate status. We're taking all the necessary steps agreed with the European Commission to implement political commitments. In just 1 year, we performed our judicial system, we relaunched the core judicial institutions and body, launched the reform of the Constitutional Court, enhanced media legislation, established the media market, intensified the fight against corruption, and introduced systemic measures to fight against money laundering. And we have put a special focus on safeguarding the rights of national minorities, as well as the focus on human rights. Importantly, all of these measures Ukraine is achieving despite the war. It is our front, the political front, the existential front, and the root for our survival. It should not be underestimated that situation no other candidate country has faced, and it only strengthens our commitment, strengthens our unity. Our main goal is to commence the accession negotiations by the end of this year. This is why we have already started necessary preparations, including self-screening of our legislation and advancing the process of legal approximation further. This is a very important moment for us. We are looking forward for your support. We are grateful for every Austrian citizen who have been standing for Ukraine, advancing and supporting Ukraine, enabling your leaders, your governments, and the members of parliament to take efforts to preserve the unity, to preserve the peace in Europe, but also to stand for every Ukrainian who needs your help. Thank you for that. Rest assured, Ukraine will bring back peace and victory to European continent. Ukraine will not let your efforts to support us down. Thank you so much, and Slava Ukraini!
And many thanks to the Deputy Prime Minister for those hugely important and significant words as we gather here for this discussion about Europe and Europe's role in the world. So I'd like to move now into our first panel. So I'd like to invite the four panellists to take to the stage. Our panel discussion will begin. It's Europe's role in the world and a bold Europe. Here we go. Thank you. If you'd like to sit here, Minister. Thank you very much. And we're focusing this panel on European neighbourhood and geopolitics. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our panel, most of whom will need no introduction. So on my left, we have Minister Alexander Schallenberg, delighted to have a representative from the Austrian government. Minister Schallenberg serves as Federal Minister for European and International Affairs. So thanks very much for joining us. We are also joined by President Vjosa Osmani of Kosovo, President of Kosovo. So very warm welcome to you too. Thank you. Alexandra Matovichuk is the founder and head of the Center for Civil Liberty. She's an Ukrainian lawyer, and this CCL was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022, so you're very welcome too. And finally, again, a name that I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with. We're joined by Zviatlana Tikhanovskaya. It's the opposition leader of Belarus. And according to independent observers, the real winner of the election there in 2020. So thank you very much for all of you for joining us. We're going to kind of structure this with a few comments from all of you to opening remarks. And Minister, we'll start with you and just to kind of push you in the direction. But I suppose the general point that we've been hearing about, has this been a momentous, a sea change for Europe in terms of its place in the world, etc. Maybe you'd give some opening thoughts on that.
Yeah, maybe I can thank you for having me. It's great to be back in Alpbach, and maybe I can echo a little bit what Andreas Streichel said at the beginning. The 24th of February, 1.5 years ago, last year, was a little bit like an ice bucket thrown at our face, tearing us from our daydreams of a post-national, post-historic Europe. And yes, we might have thought that this will go on forever and ever, and our system of liberalism, of individual rights, will sort of, by spillover, osmosis, will prevail sooner or later. We had this sense after the fall of the Iron Curtain that we have won, actually. And now we find out that actually the very way we live is for some already an act of aggression, and that we have to stand up and fight for it. But I'm actually optimistic, because who would have expected on the 23rd of February that we would stand so united within the European Union? Who would have expected that this transatlantic relationship, which is so close to my heart and important for me, would be so strong? Who would have expected we would bring together 11 sanctions package against Russia, the most far-reaching sanctions we ever applied? But even if we go back to the pandemic, we have now 3 years of unprecedented challenges on this continent. We never had a pandemic since the First World War. We thought that we will see war coming in black and white pictures from the past or coming out from pictures from other continents. Again, an unprecedented challenge. What happened? The seemingly weak, decadent, ununited, disunited Western democracies stood firm. They stood up to the challenge. So I think there's a message for us to be a little bit more optimistic, to have a little bit more sense of pride of what we're actually achieving. And if you ask me, are we bold enough? My answer is obviously no. And as a foreign minister, I would say the litmus test for the boldness, for the geostrategic effectiveness of the European Union, whether we actually learn the language of power, you could say, is in our neighborhood, is in the Western Balkans, is in Ukraine and Moldova. And I fully agree, we knew it in the past, When we took in Greece, the communities, took in Greece in 1981, it was probably not because Greece was capable of applying each and every comma of the acquis communautaire. It was about safeguarding a young democracy. Spain, Portugal, 1986, the same thing. Spain had a coup d'etat, an attempted coup d'etat in 81. 5 years later, they became member. That would be unthinkable now. We should be bold and say, let's get out of this binary thinking of either you're full member or you're not. We have ideas like gradual integration. Everything is on the table. The only thing missing is the political will. And I believe the attack of Russia has galvanized us. So Putin has not only made a mistake, he now is facing a longer border with NATO, but I believe on many accounts, the result in Europe will be exactly the contrary of what he wanted to achieve. A more united Europe, a stronger Europe, and enlarged Europe. That is my hope.
Yeah, very interesting thoughts there. Thank you very much. Which we will come back to. And your comments there on enlargement transitions very nice to President Osman about Kosovo. Maybe you could talk to us a bit about your thoughts now, this idea of bold Europe, and what are the issues that you think are priority for you in your country?
Thank you, but let me perhaps start by saying that it's such a great pleasure to be among all of you today, and coming from the youngest country in Europe, both in terms of the age of our country as well as the age of our population, is such a great pleasure to be among so many young people from all around the world. So especially a great welcome to the continent of Europe from those that are coming from outside of Europe. I do agree, and it's a great continuation of what the minister just said and what the president of the forum initially mentioned in his remarks. Absolutely, a bold Europe is an enlarged Europe, an enlarged European Union, one that clearly understands that including the Western Balkans within the EU is a key to the principle of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. In fact, we should all understand that the Western Balkans is not just some faraway neighborhood. In fact, it's a crucial part of Europe, it's at the heart of Europe, and it's a part that can actually contribute to Europe's further stability, to Europe's further development economically. And with the human potential that the Western Balkans has, it can contribute to more energized projects and some that are extremely bold, whether we're talking about a green Europe, whether we're talking about more investment into green energy, but also a Europe where countries that are truly contributing to the principles on which the European Union has been founded on are also giving their contributions to those principles. The European Union is the most important economic and peace project, I would say, in the history of humanity. And as such, we need to understand that despite the frustration, despite disappointments, we should never look elsewhere. For my country, this has always been the case. We have never looked elsewhere. We have never flirted with any other, I would say, path. The European Union is the strategic orientation not just of politicians and institutions, but it's deeply engraved within the opinions and the will of our people. Therefore, we will definitely never look elsewhere. But we do see fatigue. We see fatigue both within the members of the European Union on whether they are ready or not to include other members. But fatigue is also present among Western Balkan countries. I mean, it took North Macedonia so many years to just start the negotiation process. I mean, Montenegro has been striving to move forward, but things are going extremely slow. We had to wait for 10 years to just finish the visa liberalization process. Finally, the brilliant youth of Kosovo, who are also present here today, next year will come back to Alba Forum without a visa for the very first time, after really... Finally, after having completed the criteria for visa liberalization, in fact, many, many years ago, I really want to commend and thank Austria for being such a strong voice of support for freedom of movement for the people of Kosovo, but also for being such a strong voice for the inclusion of the Western Balkans into the enlargement process of the European Union. It's one of the countries that has always been bold on that one, perhaps because you're closer to us and you know the potential. You don't look at the Western Balkans as a burden, but as countries that can truly contribute to a stronger Europe. Secondly, I think a bold Europe is a principled Europe, especially in the wake of the war in Ukraine, with what Belarus, the people of Belarus are going through. We need to understand that talking about values is not enough. Acting upon those values is fundamental for a bold Europe. Human rights, democracy, and the rule of law should be fundamental requirements for any aspiring member, but also fundamentals for those who are within the European Union as members already. And finally, when it comes to principles, as we have learned throughout history, but it looks like, no, we haven't learned enough, appeasement of autocrats goes against the principles that form the foundation of the European Union. The more autocrats in Europe and beyond are appeased, they are emboldened, they are encouraged to commit aggression against their neighbors, to violate human rights, to violate every principle of rule of law, to not respect others, and obviously get even more and more encouragement to violate the rules-based international order. And for that reason, it is essential that within the European Union, bold decisions are also principled decisions. And we not only adopt statements that talk about values, but also either in bilateral relations or within the Union, or when looking at aspiring members, we truly persist and insist on asking for rule of law, human rights, and democracy. And my final point, and again, to agree with the Minister, a bold Europe is a united Europe, one where decisions are made together with one another, but also made at the right time, because sometimes not learning from mistakes of the past and not learning from history leads to historical mistakes. But at the same time, unity should not sacrifice the values. I do understand how difficult it is to take those unanimous decisions within the European Union, but never, never at the expense of rule of law, never at the expense of democracy, never at the expense of values that are the very fundament of what the European Union is all about. I believe that unity is fundamental for our success versus autocracies and versus tyrannies. And unity on enlargement is also in the strategic interest of the European Union itself, as the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine said. Of course, it's in our interest to join the EU, but I believe strategically speaking, as it was proven with the candidate status for Ukraine and Moldova, it's also in the strategic interest of the European Union. And my final point, I believe that a bold Europe is also one that values the Euro-Atlantic partnership. The role of the United States has proven fundamental and pivotal in keeping and preserving the peace, the stability, but also the success of what Europe is all about. So that partnership, as I think, is fundamental in making sure that Europe continues its success, but also we are successful in making sure that Ukraine wins, and also making sure that those nations that are truly honest in terms of working based on the values that the EU stands for are the ones that also move forwards towards joining the Euro-Atlantic partnership. So that's in terms of introduction.
Great.
I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you. Lots of points to pick up on there. We will no doubt return to. Moving to you, Alexandra Matvichuk, you're coming from a very different perspective as a Ukrainian lawyer, human rights defender. I was interested in some of the points that the Deputy Prime Minister made about this whole issue of accountability for Russia. I mean, maybe you could comment on that, or where are you viewing things now at the moment from where you are right at the heart of this awful conflict?
I'm a human rights lawyer, which means that I have been applying the law to defend people and human dignity. But at present, I found myself in circumstances when the law doesn't work. Russia started this war of aggression. Russia commits horrible atrocities, and the entire system of peace and security can stop it. So I think that the main question for all of us at current moment is how we people who live in 21st century will defend human beings, their lives, their freedom, their dignity. Can we rely on the law or just weapons matter? Do we allow the countries with a strong military potential and nuclear weapons to dictate their rules of the game to the entire international community and even forcibly changed internationally recognized borders? I pose these questions not just as citizens of the country which are fighting against Russian aggression. I pose these questions as a citizens of the Europe, because the answer to these questions will define our common future. Europe is less about geography than about common values, values of democracy, rule of law, and human rights. And this war has a very vivid value dimension. This is not just a war between two states, Russia and Ukraine. This is a war between two different value mindsets, authoritarianism and democracy. And Putin tried to convince the whole world that democracy, rule of law, and human rights are fake values because they couldn't protect you during the war. We must respond something to this claim. It's not just task for Ukraine. Ideas have no borders. People started to understand this only when the bombs are falling on their heads. But this war, once again, has not just military, but very vivid value dimension. And in this regard, this war is already here. And we have to be brave to admit it. Russia has declared the war on Europe. Russia is fighting against values that they are Europe hallmark. And we don't know, are we in the middle of this war? Are we in the end of this war, or it's just beginning of this war? But what we know for sure, that if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he will go further. Russia is empire. Empire has a center, but has no borders. And when empire has an energy, empire will always extend. So Europe must be bold. Europe must fulfill its role in the globalized world and defend its values. It's determination to act that will define whether or not the Europe will have a future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, a Belarusian opposition leader, Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya. Some thoughts from yourself about the current challenges. I mean, very relevant comments there about, standing up to authoritarians, this idea of appeasement, etc. I mean, maybe those thoughts are very much relevant to what's happening in Belarus.
So, first of all, for me, Europe was always about freedom. Freedom that we Belarusian people have never had. I spent almost all my life under dictatorship, and we didn't know what freedom is. And you European people living in free Europe, you might not notice this, because freedom is like air, you just breathe it. But when you lose it, it's very difficult to get it back. And today, Belarusians and Ukrainians are paying very high price for becoming free nations, free people. And You know, when back in 2020 our revolution started, I was sure that Europe will show its boldness, because freedom, it's about boldness. But then, back then, I saw rather cautious reaction of Europe on the events in Belarus. And I remember, you know, the voices that, look, it's internal crisis. Let's not interfere into this. And I always argued with this statement, because defending human rights, defending people who are striving for democratic changes, is not about internal affairs. It's obligation of every democratic, powerful, free country to support those who are on the way to it. And I think that this cautious reaction of Europe back in 2020, it split crisis, internal crisis, to the whole region. We all remember hijacking of flights, organization of migration crisis, dragging our country, Belarus, into the war, into Russian war with Ukraine. So this cautiousness, as Madam President told, emboldened dictators and untied their hands. And we are now paying the high price for this undecisiveness. And, you know, the dictators have a simple strategy, you know, to divide and conquer. And I'm sure that Putin, when he started the war, he didn't expect such unity of Ukrainian people and such unity of Europe. I think maybe at the beginning of the war, Europe started to learn how it is to be bold. And but you know what disturbs and worries me is that we see the signs of fatigue even about the war in Ukraine. It's really like bad signals. And again, dictators perceive it as weakness, and they raise the stakes. And another mistake that European politicians and countries can do is to try to make deals with dictators. We have to remember that dictators cannot be appeased and they cannot be re-educated. And some countries might prefer to close their eyes on human rights abuses and to make businesses with the regimes. And of course, you know, of course, it's awful. And we see how dictators exploit international institutions like UN or OSCE to their advantage. They use these platforms to sow hatred, to justify the war. And that's why we have to isolate regimes, not to give them foreign platforms, you know, to send these fake messages, you know, to the world. Instead, we have to give voices to people who are fighting against dictators, like Belarusian people. You know, I'm here on behalf of Belarusian nation who are fighting with dictator and simultaneously fighting with the imperialistic ambitions of Russia. It's difficult to be on our path because we are you know, simultaneously sacrificing people of Belarus. Just Belarus now is a big prison where about 60,000 people have gone through tortures, prisons, detentions in Belarus. Now up to 5,000 people are in Belarusian prisons for political motivated cases. About 500,000 Belarusians had to flee Belarus because of repressions. You know, it's awful. It's awful numbers, and. We have a lot of challenges, and one of the challenges is to bring perpetrators to justice. It's also, you know, it's about international institutions. How many people have Belarus and Ukraine sacrificed to make international institutions like ICC, for example, to work, to bring, to give arrest warrant on Lukashenko, for example. We have full evidences that Lukashenko's cronies participated in crimes against humanity. They abducted Ukrainian authors from occupied territories to Belarus, and ICC is still hesitating in giving this arrest warrant. So our task is to isolate the regime, task of powerful European countries to isolate the regime and to give voice to Belarusian people, to represent our country, and to give to show that European doors are open to you, and promise of European perspectives for Belarusian people, for example, it will energize Belarusian people, for further fight. European perspective is the best alternative, to Russian world, and we have to show this perspective to Belarusian people, and we have to fight for Europe where every human and its rights are respected. And this fight is not only about statement or tweets. It needs boldness and decisiveness. It needs bravery and patience. And I ask all the European society to go this difficult path together with Belarusians and together with Ukrainians. Give Ukraine everything they need and help us Belarusians to win our country back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lots of interesting ideas and themes there. But Minister, returning to you, and you described there vividly the kind of sense of hubris even that Europe had been, was very comfortable in itself, and it was the end of history and all that. And you did talk about enlargement and the idea, maybe you're hinting at that, Europe has taken for granted some of these countries that have been on its fringes. Do you think we're really at the cusp of a change in European thinking? I mean, ultimately, to give a country accession prospects or to move the dial forward, you need unanimity. You need all EU member states to agree to it. I mean, do you think the EU may move on this in the next few months, next year?
Well, I myself am lobbying for it and fighting for it because I believe that more and more capital is understanding that enlargement is not a bureaucratic endeavor. It's not a legalistic endeavor. It's the most important, most powerful geopolitical tool we have at our disposal. And as I said beforehand, we knew that in the past with Spain, Portugal, Greece. And if we had treated the countries like Poland and the Czech Republic at the time, the way we treat now the Western Balkans, probably wouldn't be yet member of the European Union. And we probably would have lost them already to influence of third parties. There is no vacuum in politics. It's either us or we will be suddenly confronted in our immediate neighborhood with different models. Might be Chinese, Turkish, from the Emirates, Russian, whatever, but not to our liking. So, and I believe that more and more capitalists are understanding that. But the thing is, the important thing is, what I tried to say at the beginning, let's get out of this thinking in the box, that either you're full member and you have signed accession treaty. We know that with Ukraine, for instance, common agricultural policy will be hugely difficult. But for God's sake, that cannot prevent us from moving on with Ukraine. That's not a bureaucratic thing. We can have common market minus agricultural policy, for instance.
So would you be in favour of a more incremental kind of idea, or a two-tier, or...?
Yeah, what we are thinking about, there's a name to it, is gradual integration. Why always wait until nothing is agreed until everything is agreed? That's a wrong approach. We should get this country in, have them ready in Brussels. Another example, for instance, are we out of our mind to let the Chinese build highways and railroads in the Western Balkans? At the end of the day, each highway and each railroad is connecting two EU states, Croatia and Greece, or Bulgaria and Croatia. Are we dumb stupid to do that?
Yeah.
Why are they not members of the 10 European networks? I mean, it doesn't need a lot, And when I was in Brussels, we do have a fantasy, and the only thing needed, and that's one point I disagree, we don't need institutional reforms. Those people who come out and say, okay, we could enlarge, but we need institutional reforms, are those who actually don't want it. That's a typical reflex in Europe. You have to change. No, I was part of the negotiation team for the convention and then for the Treaty of Lisbon. We did everything. We have everything there. The only thing we need is to master political will.
Yeah. Good point. You make a very, very valid, very, very interesting point about that if Europe has been effectively, you could say asleep at the wheel while other powers have, increased their presence. Now, President Osmani, because you're a diplomat, you didn't say this, and I'm not expecting you to say, but we do know that certain countries in the Western Balkans have become closer to Russia. in the last few years. I'm thinking of Serbia, for example, and you made the point there that Kosovo has maintained its kind of commitment to Europe. But, I mean, I think everyone in this room would be familiar with the fact that in the last few months we've been reading headlines about a kind of resurgence of tensions in North Kosovo. I mean, how are things now, and do you think that's going to impact negatively both countries' accession prospects? Maybe you'd kind of bring us up to date on that.
Well, first of all, I mean, I don't think I need to talk about who Serbia is. It's so obvious. It's a country that it's not in between. There's no gray zone there. They have picked Russia for their partner. It's the only European country without sanctions against Russia. It's the only country in the Western Balkans that commits aggression against its neighbors. And it's a country that it's, I think, at a 36% alignment with the EU. In contrast, Kosovo and many of our neighbors are at a 100% alignment with every foreign and security policy decision of the European Union, including immediate sanctions against Russia on day one, including updating those sanctions, not just in line with European Union decisions, but also the decisions of our partners in the United States. We are supporting the people of Ukraine in any way that we can. We are hosting journalists from Ukraine because we believe that defending and telling the truth at times of war is fundamental in fighting the Russian propaganda. But just because we have an aggressive neighbor, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't undertake our reforms in getting closer and closer to the European Union, and that's exactly what we have been doing. But having an aggressive neighbor means that you will constantly have security problems, and that's what we're facing in the north of Kosovo. Now, just let me clarify one point. Only 1/3 of the Serbs that live around Kosovo, who are around 3 to 4% of our population, but only 1/3 of these 3 to 4% actually live in the north. 2/3 of the Serbs live in the south, in the east, and the west, and they are perfectly integrated within the society and the institutions. In the north, because they border Serbia, of course, they were more instrumentalized by Belgrade. But apart from being political, the problem in the north is a rule of law problem. We're dealing with gangs.
Yeah.
We're dealing with transnational organized crime groups. And that's not just me calling them transnational organized crime groups. The US State Department, the United Kingdom have called them transnational organized crime groups. These are extremely dangerous groups that are mostly terrifying, terrorizing, intimidating, and even killing, in the case of politician Oliver Ivanovic, Serb citizens. So it is the Serbs who live in the north that are actually paying the highest price because of these groups. So once, of course, we tried to fight these organized crime groups, there was violence, and that's one of the things that we're facing at this point. So we ask for the support of Europe because by defending rule of law, by defending innocent citizens from these organized crime groups, we are actually standing up for what European Union stands for, which is rule of law, human rights, and democracy. And my final point on where are we right now when it comes to finding solutions to the recent tensions. On the 1st of September, we're going to have new administrative decisions in place when it comes to organizing new elections in the north. And then it's up to the citizens whether they want to participate in these elections or not. We ask for the support of our, especially EU and US partners, in stopping Vučić from illegal interference in the elections of another country and stopping him from, through his illegal gangs, intimidating Serbs from participating in free elections.
Yeah,
because
just to come in here, because there is nobody on the panel representing Serbia, obviously there was a lot of issues that Brussels and Washington had about those elections that were held by Kosovo earlier in the year. So just to be clear on that, because I am conscious that Serbia is not
elections were
here.
fully supported by both Washington and Brussels. An action of mayors entering the buildings,
their offices,
which is very separate. From the holding of elections. Elections were held in full compliance and coordination with our partners.
So do you think, do you worry, apart from that specific situation that's now flared up, but do you worry, I know, we were talking about earlier about, you were saying there that respect for Ukraine who's now on this accession path, but do countries in the Western Balkans feel hard done by, that they have been waiting in the wings for so long, and now all the attention is on Ukraine, saying, oh, Ukraine, needs a path to European membership. that must be, do you feel ambivalent about that? Is that difficult for countries like your own country that's been, diligently working towards EU accession, not really progressing very far, and all of a sudden all the attention now is on Ukraine and Moldova also?
Now, I know that some of my fellow leaders in the Western Balkans felt that way. I'm certainly not one of them. I very much welcomed the moving further of the accession process for both Ukraine and Moldova. And I think that actually woke up Europe in terms of what its own strategic interest. And I truly believe that in that sense, it helped EU member states understand that the more countries that truly believe in the EU values are brought in, the better. So I think that fundamentally helps the further integration of the Western Balkans. And I think, of course, the attention is rightly on Ukraine because, as it was perfectly pointed out, Russia has waged the war on Europe, on all of us. And the Western Balkans actually should be seen as part of the bigger picture because the minister clearly said there's never a vacuum. Russia has always been interested to expand its malign influence in the Western Balkans. Now, of course, in Kosovo, we never allowed it. And we're the only country in the Western Balkans that are not part of the China Road and Belt Initiative. But that doesn't mean that we should just stop fighting this malign influence. Russia has historically been interested to destabilize Europe through the Western Balkans. So I think it's part of the bigger picture if we keep both the Western Balkans as well as Ukraine at the center of attention.
Okay, so it's a positive development for everyone. It can lift the tide, if you like. So can you just talk to us a bit about, in your own country, I mean, I know a lot of people in Europe, I'm thinking of people in Poland in particular, on those fringes, on the borders of the EU and NATO, are suddenly extremely worried about what's happening in Belarus. Are you picking that up from a lot of, particularly our Centre and East European citizens, that there's this renewed interest in what's happening just across the border? And do you think that's ultimately going to help Belarus make that transition into democracy?
I see how many countries want to help us, Belarusian people, to return our country back, through isolation of the regime, through imposing sanctions, though there are a lot to do, in this direction, through helping us to restore our national identity. But of course, what I know is that without free Belarus and Ukraine, the European project will not be finished. That without independent Belarus and Ukraine, there will be no safe Europe at all. So that's why, of course, it's in the interest most of all of our closest neighbors, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Ukraine, of course, but also in the interest of the entire Europe to help us Belarusians to make Belarus a democratic country and get out our country from the grip of Russian Empire. Because, I really don't want Europe to build borders between Europe and Belarus. We historically belong to Belarus, and we have to return our country to its real family.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Just finally, before we take a couple of questions, just some final thoughts from yourself. Alexandra, do you think there's buy-in at European level in particular for the issue of accountability for Russia? There's a lot of, we don't want to, it's a very complex issue about the idea of having a tribunal, the crime of aggression is not recognised. Some countries are against that, but do you think it's too soon to have that conversation when Ukraine is still in the midst of fighting this war?
May I bring a human perspective to this conversation? I would like to tell you a story of 14-year-old Sofia, who, together with her mother, her younger brother and younger sister, was hiding in bomb shelters in Mariupol while Russian army tried to occupy the city. And this family was bombarded by aircraft. And now I want to quote Sofia. I went to dig out my mother. I tried to do it with my hands because there were no shovels nearby. Some aircrafts were flying around me. I was also scared that moment, but I wanted to help my mom. I dug her up so she could breathe. And then I went to ask for help. Her younger brother died immediately. Sofia's mother died after several hours when she was rescued from the rubble of residential buildings. What I want to tell with this story, can I ask you directly, is Sofia, her mother, her brother and her sister, just numbers? Or they're humans and they deserve for a chance for justice? Do hundreds and hundreds of thousands of victims of this war will deserve for effective investigations, or we will put justice into dependence of the Putin's regime's power and just wait when and how the war will end? Do we in 21st century can go further? Because sometimes when I'm speaking about issues of accountability with politicians, I'm still see that we are all looking to the world through the prism of Nuremberg trials, which was a huge step to establish law and justice in past century. But it was a trial under Nazi war criminals when their regime had collapsed. But we live in a new century. We must move further. We cannot wait. We have to establish special tribunal now and hold Putin, Lukashenko, the top political officials and military command of Russian states accountable. If people are not numbers, if we are not liars, if everything which we put in our constitutions, declarations and conventions, like each life matters, is true.
Yeah, very effective illustration there of the importance of this issue. We're already behind time, so I'm going to open the floor for some really quick questions. 2 questions. If there's anyone there who has a burning question, if not, we can. I think we might move it on. I'll just take one question from our app here. It's a good point, and I'll go to you, Minister, actually, as the final kind of comment on this, because we didn't really touch on this. It's a very good question from Gaia Grazelli. A major component of today's world order is the belief that global economic interdependence and interconnection, like trade, helps prevent conflicts. This did not work out with the current conflict at Europe's heart. Why and how can it be avoided in the future? So final thoughts.
Actually, that's very true, because we had this belief that if we create mutual economic dependencies, it would sort of minimize the political risks. It has proven wrong with autocratic systems. But on the other side, we cannot decompose the planet. I mean, we have to be very watchful here in Europe and the Western world that we don't go beyond, the pendulum is going to the other side, and we cannot ghost China or Russia. We cannot cancel them. They're part of the global situation as they are. And globalization has, in the end, made us more, prosperous and gave us more possibilities. I believe the biggest thing, and I fully agree with the President of the European Commission, is the key word is de-risking. We have found out during the pandemic, we have found out now at the war, you cannot have one provider. You should not produce everything in China. We have to de-risk, we have to diversify, but we cannot go back to the 19th century, so to say. That would be a grave, grave mistake. And we have probably, what ended on the 24th of February, I would hope, is naivety. It's the end of wishful thinking. We had the tendency to look at things the way we want them to be. Even on the 23rd of February, I was at the Munich Security Conference with all the leaders of the Western world. We didn't believe that Putin would launch a second World War kind of attack because we didn't want to.
And Zelensky was pleading for help.
And it might be cynical, but actually what he did now, he slapped us in the face. So now we awake, and I hope we won't fall asleep again within the European Union, that we stay awake and take the right actions.
Thank you very much for that final thought. Thank you very much to the panel. Thanks for your help. Yeah, you can finish up. Thank you. before our next panel, we're first going to hear a video message by Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General. So we'll be hearing from him now.
Greetings to everyone gathered in beautiful Alpbach. Since your first meeting in 1945, this forum has become a unique space for reflection and action across generations, geographies, and disciplines. Today, you are meeting at a time of great tension and turmoil. War has returned to the European continent with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And all around the world, old and new conflicts rage on. Climate chaos is devastating lives and livelihoods. A cost of living crisis is worsening inequalities and hitting the most vulnerable first and worst. And the Sustainable Development Goals, our blueprint for peace and prosperity on a healthy planet, are slipping from our reach. Dear friends, we need to take bold steps towards bold solutions. We must radically rethink our approach to peace and security, our relationship with nature, and the structures of global governance. We must act to contain the risks of new technologies, stem the spread of mis and disinformation and hate, and make the digital space more inclusive and safer. Throughout, we must seek shared solutions to common problems, guided by the values of solidarity, equality, and sustainability. At the United Nations, we are working to advance global cooperation on all fronts. Through our common agenda, we have put forward concrete proposals towards a renewed multilateralism that is more inclusive, networked, and effective. The months ahead will be critical as a series of summits provide vital opportunities for progress, starting with the SDG Summit in September and leading to the Summit of the Future next year. I count on your engagement, and I urge you to be bold. Let us raise our ambition and together build a more just, sustainable, and peaceful future for all. Thank you.
Yeah. Use a Kirsten, if you're just in the middle there. No, this. Reinhardt here. Thank you. No, here. Here we go. Now, first of all, just to say, we now have an overflow room, such is the extent of interest in this event. So it was being live streamed in a neighbouring room. So if you're interested, and I know a lot of people still standing, just move there to the exit and our staff will show you where that is. So thank you very much for your patience on that. Okay, we're moving to our second session, although we could have kept talking there for hours with our first panellist. Such was the level of interesting commentary and different perspectives. But now we're going to turn to a discussion, Europe's role in the world and a bold Europe, democracy and climate. So a slightly different focus, but maybe touching on some of the issues we have just been discussing. So on my left, I'm joined by Reinhard Bütikofer, member of the European Parliament, who is very well known to us all in Brussels. We've Kirsten Dunlop, CEO of EIT Climate, KIC. And we also have the former Minister of Education of Nigeria, Obi Ezekwesili. So thank you very much all for joining us. We're going to again just start with some opening comments from you all. Reinhard Bütikofer, would you like to start us off? Now, I mean, you're a man who wears many hats in Brussels, and I don't know if some of the previous commentary sparked some kind of thoughts in you, or would you like to comment more on the whole challenge now for Europe in this pivotal year on this idea of democracy as well as climate?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me and being able to join this very engaging and hopeful conversation. Maybe I add a little tone of skepticism, because even though it is true what the minister said, that we can and we should be proud of how Europe pulled together after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we should not self-congratulate too much, because at least I feel, and listening to the previous panel, I felt that our guests from other countries said that in very polite terms also we're not living up to the challenges that we see ahead of us. And that pertains to both the dimensions that you want to talk about on this panel. As regards energy, I could proudly argue that Germany, that had been dependent on Russian gas supplies to 55% of our consumption, has managed to cut that dependency. On the other hand, in order to achieve that goal, we went around the world buying up everything at whatever it cost and created a lot of havoc with regard to poorer countries that could not afford competing with us on the energy market. And that is an example of how we fail too often to see the global picture. This conversation is supposed to talk about Europe's global role, and most of the time when we promise to talk about Europe's global role, we still talk about ourselves. And I think we should talk more about our role in the international system. We did not conceive of the indirect effects of this war on food security in so many poor countries. And we're still not up to the challenge. With regard to energy, yes, we see now, and very few people in Brussels would contradict that statement. We see now that we have to invest more into renewables, but no, we're not bold with regard to the Green Deal. In fact, the opposite is happening at the moment. The Green Deal that President von der Leyen made the centerpiece of her policy when she came into office 4 years ago has never been challenged more than it is at the moment. So we're not bold. And I think we cannot be bold just as Europeans. I repeat that line. We need to team up with other countries. And I think we should take note, for instance, of the fact that just the last weekend in South Africa, a new group of countries came together trying to turn what has been a non-Western grouping, namely the BRICS, into an anti-Western grouping. And might surprise some of us, but they had some success in doing that. Hard to understand. How could anybody want to be in bed with the dictators from Russia and China? But guess what? Some of these countries maybe have more beef with us than they have with China. We cannot define a bold position for Europe without defining our challenges on a global scale. And that also extends to the second dimension, which is democracy. The first contribution would be to revitalize our own democracies. Some people might recall that President Reagan once called Western democracy the shining city on the hill. Well, I don't think a lot of people feel that the city is that shining. Neither in the United States nor in many European countries. We're less democratic in the European Union today, with more authoritarian tendencies than we've been. That's one element. But then, if we want to be bold with regard to democracy, will we dare supporting democracies, even if it takes running some risk? Are we daring to support Taiwan's lively, robust democracy? Or are we afraid of even mentioning the topic? Taiwan's democracy is an example to many countries in that region. It depends on the solidarity between democracies. Are we going to pursue that policy? The European Parliament does. The European Union does not yet. Will we change that? Are we going to work with democracies like Indonesia? Indonesia refused to claim that they might become a partner of BRICS. Are we going to understand that and invest in working with them and cherishing their pledge to build democracy more than the concerns of some of our industrialists that feel that their markets are not open enough yet for our multinationals? Can we make that judgment a leading principle? I think these are the questions that we have to tackle if we want to be bold in Europe.
Very, very interesting points there. Very interesting point we will no doubt come back to. And moving to yourself, Kirsten Dunlop, as a former climate expert on the whole issue of climate and innovation, what are your thoughts at this forum when we're talking about a bold Europe?
Well, let me start with a story that encapsulates something, I think, of the dilemma, the opportunity, and the question of choice when it comes to how we define democracy in Europe. I lead an organization that is responsible for working with a number of other critical partners to lead the European mission on cities, which is a commitment of 112 cities to decarbonize by 2030. And for most of those cities, that is not currently possible. It's 7 years. The story I'm thinking of is Madrid. I was in Madrid in July, so 1 month ago, and it was close to 46 degrees. I was in a session working with all of the city administrators on the challenge, really around the impossibility of pulling off a mission and nonetheless the imperative to do so. And that was very much literally 1 day or 2 days before the Spanish election, in which the democratic process in Spain brought in a government, 7% of which believes and is actively arguing for the fact that climate change is a fiction and that 46 degrees is just the new normal, but not something that humans have produced and not something that we should transition away from. And I was in dialogue with a group of city administrators explaining to me that one of the things they've just realized they're dealing with is that in the streets of Madrid, the argument to create a 15-minute city in Madrid, in other words, to maximize local adjacencies and vicinities and an ease of accessing food, transport, schools, education, and energy systems close to home, is a European conspiracy to create ghettos. So you should fight back. And for me, that encapsulates the extremely rich, thick dilemma and challenge and opportunity of democracy as the system that we use in Europe to face into climate, and the relationship between climate and democracy as we go forward in the world and think about what we stand for. Climate is an intensely systemic event. It affects human societies and social systems. And in fact, I belong to a group of people who believes that, in fact, the thing that we are likely to face first, that we are already facing first, before even our extreme discomfort, physical risk and health challenges as a result of climate change effects, are the social breakdowns, collapses and tensions, sense of conflicts, migration, and deep sense of fear and despair that is coming now. The social breakdowns and tipping points associated with what it means to not tackle climate, and the reality of the fact that we are on track for 2 to 3 degrees of warming by 2060. That's now. So the question I am holding is, how are we responding? Readiness. How are we responding? How will we respond? The quality of response of social systems to something like that becomes incredibly responding. And I don't mean by responding, go back to something we idealize of the past. I mean renewal. I mean the capacity to adapt and to ingest and induce change in ourselves, a capacity to accept a difference. And that I really hold on to as a sense of that's the value of democracy as a way, as our constitutive element in Europe for addressing and dealing with and bringing to life that readiness. Because democracy is a capillary system. It means it's a culture of diffused social awareness that produces a sense of choice and agency in all of us. It means every single cell in our body politic is aware, builds a sense of understanding, needs to respond, needs to engage in self-renewal. But the question for me, and I think in the work that we are seeing and that we are doing now in Europe and that Europe is trying to do and lead in the world, is what kind of body politic, what kind of democracy, what kind of cellular system are we dealing with? How are we bringing to life our democracies? How are we resubstantiating that idea since it's been so horribly hollowed out in the last decades? I think there is a real possibility that we do achieve a net zero world with our technologies, and it will not be worth having. There are choices in what we are locking ourselves into about how that world is brought about. And in the middle of it is who are we? What do we stand for? What values do we bring to life? So I think one of the interesting challenges for Europe in its boldness, or the challenge and opportunity of being bold, is a forking moment. Do we continue to live with a cringe culture with respect to the capital market economy of the US that is tagged democracy? Or do we actually deeply build a democratic, democracy-based transition and a democracy-based economy? Because that is a choice. And I come from one of my pieces of living experience in the world is living in Australia, where we grow up with the idea of cultural cringe, which is the idea that everything in the rest of the world is smarter, better, and somehow more sophisticated than it is in Australia. And ironically, working in innovation in a European context, I notice strange echoes of the same. What they do in Silicon Valley is so much better. It's faster, it's more capitalized, it works quicker, there are capital markets, it gets to market, it makes value, it produces prosperity. Go to San Francisco and walk the streets of San Francisco and ask yourself, is that the prosperity that you want this democracy to produce in the face of waves and waves of crisis that are storms, that are heat, that are health, that are diseases, that are migration in hundreds of millions of people seeking safety? That is the design choice for our democracy. The well-being of all at the core of our strategic design and our practical implementation. But I think there's something really critical here. Antonio Guterres has called for a new social contract. A new social contract based on well-being of all, on the essence of principles of sufficiency, of equality, of equity. And I have come back recently for Colombia, learning and watching the immense power of the two phrases being used in every sentence and thinking, my God, Europe's actually going to need to learn how this and learn it fast. Climate action and peace action together as two intertwined elements. And I'm coming back from the work that we're doing in Africa and realizing how much more sophisticated African solutions in climate adaptation are compared to European solutions, because complacency has become our currency. So there's a question here for me in the democratic foundations of a bold Europe. We need to think about a significant shift in our own literacy of what we mean by that word, what it stands for, and what we stand for in bringing it to life in our way of facing into climate change and biodiversity. We need to build skills and literacy and dialogue and stories of those values, of those principles, of what it means to live well when we live in a sustainable and regenerative way. And that really means bringing to life hopeful alternatives that revive the sense of a European project. One of my questions to myself coming to Albach for the first time was, I believe that the greatest possible chance of keeping the European project together is climate change. It sounds perverse and horrible, but actually it's probably the one uniting thing that might really encourage all of us to come together and realize the value of a Europe. But our biggest challenge is, how is that value brought to life?
Thank you. Very, very interesting thoughts. Very interesting thoughts. Obi Squasili, your thoughts opening this, whole conversation about Europe's role in the world and a bold Europe. How does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I laughed out when the parliamentarian said something to the effect of Europe thinking that it is about itself and not the rest of the world. At least you're better than the US in some sense. in the US, when there is, they've got this World Series that happens only in New Jersey. So it's called World Series.
In New Jersey.
It's in New Jersey. And so, you're definitely better than the US to that effect. But on a more serious note, I think that I first want to acknowledge this forum for doing something that I believe that the rest of the world really should be doing with its young people, having intergenerational conversations. It is...
Yep.
It's absolutely important. So I congratulate you, Mr. President, for continuing the tradition of something that started as far back as 1945. And to then move on to that, from that to say that when you have a topic that says bold Europe, it definitely suggests that more people are realizing how not so bold Europe is today. And there is nothing more helpful to the human spirit than ownership of a problem, because you cannot solve a problem you deny. And so the fact that Europe is alongside its young people confronting the reality that there was once a Europe that could hold its head up and say we are bold, although definition of that bold from the perspective of an African would be nuanced. But it still is a good thing that we're having this topic. And so my number one point about bold Europe would be that it has to be a Europe that is self-reflective of history. Europe's neighbor, proximate neighbor, as a continent, is my continent. It's Africa. A bold Europe would be a Europe that agrees that Africa cannot willy-nilly just go with Europe on every issue Europe wants, simply because Europe once upon a time straddled Africa, colonizing many of the countries, being exploitative and extractive of that region of the world. What Europe that wants to act boldly would do in 21st century world is to recognize that there is a new generation of Europeans who actually look back at that history and think it was not a good history, and yet are very bold to build person-to-person, business-to-business relationship with Africa on the basis of partnership. The bureaucrats with the old and dated mindset of Africa need to retire so that this younger generation that understand that it is about the cumulation of ideas and the diversity of those ideas that will take us into a prosperous future that is equitable. Number two is that a bold Europe would be a Europe that stops looking at Africa as a humanitarian case. It would be a bold Europe would be a Europe that looks at Africa and sees the possibility of a contiguous zone of prosperity and stability. Not a Europe that makes immigration the heart and mind of its relationship with Africa. It would be a Europe. A bold Europe would be a Europe that sees Africa as a business case. A Europe that does not ask me as an African, what do you think about the Chinese? Why? You are Africa's proximate neighbor, and you're worried about a country that's how many nautical miles away from your neighbor. You have to be asking yourself, what did we get wrong? That's what a bold Europe would do. A bold Europe would stop being hypocritical. And what do I mean by this? Europe took a position around the issue of climate change and the various options of energy generation for the world. And suddenly something went off. And a redefinition of what energy security would mean in terms of sources of energy mix happened. So suddenly, gas has become an important part of the equation. Even coal has become an important part of the equation. And it actually confidently, in a wrong way, goes across Africa, picking up prospects of these resources. Whereas your proximate neighbor has just 35% of its people with access to energy. It made it difficult for these countries to have access to the capital that could develop their diverse sources of energy. And suddenly, because Europe's own energy security is threatened, it goes back on its word. A bold Europe would be a Europe that the word that I take that back. What it says is, what you're doing is so loud, I cannot hear what you're saying. Europe has to work back on this. Because the truth is, Europe needs Africa. A bold Europe would look at the demographics and what the demographics are saying to us in terms of the labor force of the world. Our continent, Africa, is going to be 1 out of every 3 young people in the workforce of the world by 2030 are going to be coming from that continent. Can I just end? You called me to come. I believe you called me as a friend. And friends tell the truth. They don't do diplomacy. They are very direct. So, our continent is a continent that Europe today, with the present mindset, would miss out on. And I say it with every boldness. Europe did not see China coming 40 years ago. They didn't see it coming. You also are not seeing that there are 3 game changers that would make Africa become. These three game changers are Africa's young people, Africa's women, and technology. When a Europe that is not seeing Africa the way it should see Africa is missing out on the business case that is Africa that could help Europe regain its competitiveness in the world. Europe's problem, it has macroeconomic stability issues, but the real issue for Europe is its competitiveness. And we saw what happened with COVID. How could the entire world collaborate to build one production center for all of us? That was disastrous. A bold Europe would look at that story and would use the data that show that Africa can be that place of diversification of the opportunities for structural competitiveness of Europe, and not anything beyond seeing the continent as a continent that it appeases by doing little pieces of development assistance. So let me end on this note, the young ones. For you, the young Europeans, I see a huge opportunity already. Many of you are part of project teams that include your contemporaries from Africa. The greatest disservice that we have today is that we have democratic societies where there is really not much democracy going on. You've got old people who have hijacked the democratic space. It is time for your generation to confront this. The democracy recession that we have is not by mistake. It is happening precisely to upset you enough to understand that all other things you're seeking for will not be optimized until you renew your democratic spaces. It is time to heed the call of Plato. Plato said that those who think that politics is beneath them will ultimately be ruled by their inferiors. I am certain that there are times when you watch what goes on in your political space, just like I do of my political space, and you wonder, what exactly is this? Nobody will renew democracy other than the younger generation that are interested in societies that are more equitable, that are more equal, societies where people question their privileges, and societies where truly all of those values that Europe talks about are not merely in documents, but they show up in terms of human relationship and interaction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. On that point, on that triumphant point, and the talk of the next generation and its, their role in this, is there anybody of the younger age group here for a final question? I don't see anyone over the age of 30 with their hands up. Yes, somebody over there. I won't ask your age, but I see this. Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name is Cruz, and one of the things that I wanted to talk about was the recent stuff that's happening in Niger and the relationship with France and Niger, and how Europe challenges these narratives that continue to persist, and what is our role in the European identity in combating this.
Obviously, I think you'd be the person to answer this development in Niger. What's your reading of that?
Well, I think that it is very clear that there is a generation that has grown into the public space of our continent that are questioning everything that was taken as normal in the past. So, what they question is, how is it that after many decades of independence, the continent hasn't made the kind of progress that they expected would be made? And so they blame the leaders. They actually don't blame mostly people outside. But in blaming the leaders, they are able to identify those who enable bad leadership on the continent. There is an enabling of bad governance that, contrary to Europe's avowed interest in good governance, we have seen happen in many of the countries of Africa. And the younger generation of Africans are tired of that. They are tired of being failed by those that lead them, and they are even offended by the fact that they have countries in Europe that support that. For example, I have seen instances where the defense of a regime in Africa by countries in Europe will not pass the smell test of what good governance is. And yet, it would happen. Why? Because Europe would put its own economic, social, or security interest ahead of the need for the people of countries in Africa to have good governance. I am not exaggerating. It is real. So the younger generation of Africans are totally fed up with this. Sadly, in being fed up with this, a big mistake is possible. So, anything but Europe, right? Therefore, some Russia, China comes around and they appear appealing. But it cannot be appealing. It has to be that the people of my continent will define our own, not based on anyone, anytime pretending to be friends. So the capacity of our own civil society to shape and frame the basis of the building of our democracy is what's missing in all of this. France in Niger is the outpouring of an agitated young population who haven't seen democracy fail to deliver dividends of good governance, are finding their way to some other solution. And that finding their ways is being mismanaged in all kinds of ways. So internal democracy internal fight for democracy is what would have to happen in each of the countries where democracy has so far delegitimized itself by being hijacked by those who poorly govern and the people in European capitals that at different times and for different reasons support poor governance.
Very, very interesting final thought there on the perspective of young people in Africa on the situation in Niger. Okay, final question, very, very quickly. Somebody with their hand up.
Hi, thank you very much. So my question is for all the panelists. One of the best events I've ever participated was at the European Parliament, and it was called Beyond Growth. It was an amazing conference, and it really inspired me, and it was the first time I found out about the degrowth movement. It's basically saying how you cannot grow anymore sustainably, you cannot grow anymore green. So I wanted to ask the panelists, what is their opinion on how we can push a degrowth movement coming from Europe that can compete with China.
Okay, sustainably though, with a sustainable. Anyone want to come in on this? Our two panelists here didn't speak. Yeah, off you go, Kirsten. Thanks.
So that's actually been one of the topics of this conference in these meetings in these last few days. I have a couple of reflections on. I think that what I was referring to and what we are referring to in the choices we make about what kind of economic system enables us to live sustainably are absolutely critical, and they are entirely around how do we move beyond a capital market-driven, extractive, consumption-based economy into economic thinking, economic models that are based on natural systems of abundance, generosity, ecosystem services, regeneration, restoration, balance. We know we need to design that for ourselves. We know that there are a number of good working propositions for how we might do that. We have here Yamina, who has succeeded finally after hard struggles in getting the concept of sufficiency included into the IPCC IR6 report. I personally would argue passionately against a complete rebranding of degrowth, because anything that polarizes and locks itself into an opposition with something is unlikely to be the new language we need for a new economic system and a new human design for productive activity and life that is in balance with one another and in the planet. But that's not because I challenge the intent, the substance, and the point. I am arguing for the fact that we find language to describe something that we have not yet managed to achieve for ourselves and begin to really demonstrate, trial, experiment, and scale. What does that look like in practice? There are so many people out there in the world working on pieces of this. One of the big opportunities we have is to begin to join forces in genuine partnership, and that's where I would really wish to reinforce from my side the value and the importance of a co-creative, co-design partnership across continents in order to look and understand what does that actually look like. Yes, that is one of the things that gives me hope. The beginnings of movement building, concrete examples, large-scale demonstrations, frameworks like Europe's Horizon Europe missions that create a large-scale possibility for market building along alternative lines. But then that, and maybe I'll pass to you, requires a significant shift in coherence in European policy, so that we do not have a number of European policies like the Common Agricultural Policy, or the Critical Raw Materials Act that are explicitly embedding an attachment to growth, even in their naming, an attachment to extractive growth, and an attachment to privileging some things over others because they drive economic prosperity, which is actually about economic revenue, above system revenue growth, not about the rebuilding of a completely newly designed economic model. And that, I think, is one of Europe's big, bold challenges, is how do you take the entire suite of European policies that are nested and really drive in coherency and consistency across the whole suite so that what we actually get is what we're trying to achieve.
Our final words to you, Rainer Brutkover.
I guess it's become obvious that any attempt to measure societal progress or wealth in terms of GDP growth is misguided. But some ideas are so wrong that even the opposite is wrong. And I think this is such a case. So if you say growth is not the measure, neither is degrowth. The question that I would want to focus on is how will we combine the necessary transformation of our economic basis and our traditions of consumption with a clear and central focus on social justice and inclusiveness. And there is enough evidence that the language of degrowth is not delivering that. The language of degrowth is going to drive a lot of people that are at the poorer end of our societies into an opposition against green transformation. And you see that if you look at what happens in the United States. In the United States, you don't anymore have a real conversation between Democrats and Republicans about green transformation. It just doesn't happen. When John McCain was still around, who died just 10 years ago, religious conservatives were discussing green transformation under funny names. I recall an article that had the headline, "Would Jesus drive an SUV?" Well, that's some way of talking about it. Today, such an article could not be written because it's become an issue of a stark, an insurmountable antagonism in the center of the American society.
Very true.
And we should not allow that to happen here. And that means we need a good language to make people understand that we're not driving ones against the others.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much to our panel. Okay, one tiny thing, yeah. Okay, one final thought. Very brief, very brief.
No, I simply wanted to recall a thread connecting today's discussions with yesterday's. There is one major, really worked example response from the Club of Rome. Its name is Earth for All, and I recommend really looking at a way of arguing how would we get to a different way of thinking about this.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to our panel. Stay with us. We're not done yet, panel. Thank you. Just to finish up now, we're going to have a demonstration by Rob Hopkins of Transition Network. Rob, you're very welcome to come to the stage. Thank you.
Good evening. Hello. Do stick around. We're going to be about 10 minutes and we're going to make Alpbach history. And you're going to be delighted you're able to tell people that you were here for this session. Just 1 second. So as we've heard, I'm Rob Hopkins, by the way, from the Transition Movement, which is about bottom-up, community-led responses to the climate emergency, and you'll find transition groups in about 50 different countries around the world. And we are, as we've heard, very much in a climate and ecological emergency as we speak. And yet, just in 2022 alone, the G20 nations subsidized fossil fuels by about $1.4 trillion. And climate change demands that we reimagine absolutely everything: economics, energy, food. And as we've heard, we can see that as being an enormous imposition, or we can look at that as being a really thrilling invitation and possibility. And Jim Dator had a quote which appears on the front window of the Institute for the Future in the United States. He said, "Any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous." I think it's really important that actually, if there's one thing I'd like to bring here today, is to urge you to all be maybe a bit more ridiculous in the work that we all do. In terms of, if the ideas that we put forward aren't at least a little bit ridiculous, they're probably nowhere near ambitious enough. And a lot of the work that I do at the moment is really about longing. How do we cultivate longing for the kind of future that we've been talking about here today? Don DeLillo, in his novel The Underworld, said, "Longing on a large scale is what makes history." Longing on a large scale is what makes history. So how do we cultivate longing So what I want to do in the session today is to start by telling you that in the town where I come from, in the southwest of England, we have actually succeeded in building the world's first fully functioning time machine. Ooh. Thank you. I mean, for heaven's sake, it's a fully functioning time machine, for heaven's sake. And you might think I'm joking, but actually here we are. This is myself and my colleague preparing for one of our regular journeys into 2030, and we travel there to different futures, because the future is not set. There are various different pathways to various different futures that we can take. And so after Brexit, it became very difficult to actually move the big time machine around. But I've bought a small portable version that we've created after Brexit. Getting an export license for a time machine took months and months. It was very, very complicated. So I've bought a small portable version, and we're going to use it in a moment. But before we do that, I wonder if I might invite you to make a pair with somebody that you didn't know before you came here this evening. We'll just take a minute and look out for my hand going in the air, but just find a pair with somebody you didn't know before you came here. Okay, everybody have a pair? Thank you. So you might want to look out for, if you see me put my hand in the air, that's an invitation to stop speaking, otherwise I'll run over my time. So you might wonder why I've put you in a pair. Well, we've just spent 2 years with the pandemic and in lockdown, and we often hear this sort of thing that we live in an epidemic of loneliness. And I think that even if you don't enjoy this, you'll have met one person you didn't know before you came, and I think that's really, really important. And I've done this at the beginning of my talks now for about 12 years, and so far I've had 4 couples come up to me and say, you know that thing you do at the beginning of your talks? And one baby as well. So be careful, that's all I'm saying. So what we're going to do, the other thing I have to teach you is the noise that a time machine makes. This is very, very important, otherwise it doesn't work. So it sounds like this, but with you all joining in as well. It sounds like a I'm not sure that's really going to break the time-space continuum, do you? Maybe let's try that one more time. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much. So I wonder if I could just ask the people who are doing the lights to lower the lights a little bit. Thank you. And I'm just going to turn on my time machine here. Oh, there we go. Fantastic. So I'm going to ask if you might close your eyes. And in a moment, we're going to turn that time machine on, and we're going to travel just to 2030, not far, just 7 years out. But we're traveling to a 2030 that's not a utopia and it's not a dystopia, but it's the 2030 that resulted from us doing absolutely everything we could possibly have done in the time between now and then. You're traveling to a 2030 which is radically lower carbon, well on the way to decolonization, delights in its diversity, is more fair, more equal, more just. And we're going to turn it on. And then in your imagination, we'll just take a minute in silence. And in your imagination, take a walk around in that world and use all of your senses. What does it smell like? What does it taste like? What does it feel like? So you're tapping into the future that you really, really long for. Okay, let's head to 2030. So if you keep your eyes closed, if you could just turn towards your neighbour and just share with them, what were your impressions? What did you see? What did you feel? What did you hear? Go. Okay, thank you. If I could invite you to come back again to 2023. Thank you. I think there may be a radio microphone or two. It would be lovely if anybody had anything you'd like to share, anything you were surprised by, anything that you'd like to share from what you saw doing that. Yes, over there. And there's a microphone coming to you. I'll just turn this off because otherwise dinosaurs start appearing and all sorts of crazy.
Fine.
Yes.
I imagined like a standard European street with a lot of trees, and also felt very, very safe at like midnight. And then it has like a lot of trees. What did I say? Trees already? And also I thought of like a new public transportation system where it takes me to my door, but it's still public transport. And I also thought about lakes, like we can still all get in the nature, swimming in the lakes, in the mountains, and have clean air and feel safe and happy and peaceful. Yeah?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. There's a lady here as well.
So what I've seen, it was not on a small level, it was on a scale, more in a grow scale. I've seen more Africans well represented in many places, international places, sitting here, and maybe at more international congresses and forums. I've seen more schools, more businesses, more growth, more diplomats between the EU and Africa, from the north to the west, to the east to the south. That's what I've seen.
Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you. And the young man behind there?
So I was standing on a bustling street full with people, but they didn't rush. They had time, they had no stress, and they looked quite happy. They didn't seem to have to worry about how they're going to pay the rent at the end of the month. They didn't seem to have to worry about their future. About the pensions, because we as a society decided to live in solidarity with each other.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you all so much for doing that. And that's an exercise that I've done with 10 people in a workshop. I did it with 1,500 people in a hall in Brussels. I've done it with thousands of people. What's always fascinating to me is that you often tap into similar things, a cleaner air, that actually, the things that we really long for. Nobody ever says, we've got a new IKEA that's 4 times bigger than the one we had in 2023, or my iPhone 28 makes toast, or something like that. And it's important that we do that, I think, because as the great bell Hooks once said, what we cannot imagine cannot come into being. And all great movements for change, all great activism is about trying to put a new North Star, put a story in front of us. As Walida Imarisha says, all organizing is science fiction. And it's the longing and the stories that are going to be what makes a difference. So my contribution to this idea of a bold Europe, I think that a bold Europe is one that is truly bold, because it would be prepared to wear, but that's ridiculous, as a badge of honor, in terms of real, true ambition and doing ideas that are way, way, way outside the box, because we need to move quickly, and that's what we need our ideas to be. And might a key element of actually achieving a zero-carbon society be our ability to create the conditions in our society for the imagination. At the moment, we're doing the very opposite. We know the more cortisol and stress and anxiety in an economy, the more the imagination shrinks and desiccates at the worst possible time in history for us to be doing that. So we have to create an economy within which the imagination can flourish. And I just want to leave you with a thought from Peter Kalmus, an incredible climate scientist and a great inspiration, who, when he's asked what gives him hope, he said, the fact that we have barely tried yet. Don't let anybody say, this is that, we've run out of time with it, we don't know what to do. We know all the things we have to do, and we've barely tried them. And with some imagination and some playfulness and delight in this, of course we can do it. And thank you so much for time traveling with me here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What a great way to end the session. Thank you to everyone for all your attention. Just to let you know, the Future Food Market is now outside once you go outside here, so don't miss that. Thank you very much again, and enjoy the next couple of days. Thank you.